And I want to set a quick context for our first session. Since 2012, Creative Many's Creative State research reports have affirmed the economic and social contributions of Michigan's nonprofit arts and cultural sector and built a compelling case for the importance of increasing state investment in our cultural assets. And then in 2014, our first creative industries report expanded our focus on the economic influence of Michigan's creative economy, both for-profit and nonprofit, bringing increased attention to the economic power of these industries and their untapped potential in state, regional, and local economic development strategies. And then, as I mentioned before, 1 year ago today, we renamed our organization Creative Many Michigan. And it's kind of hard to believe, but on that very same day, with a case of quite impeccable timing from the federal government, the U.S. Economic Development Administration awarded Creative Many with a significant local technical assistance grant to support a second, deeper phase of our creative industries research. Slated for release later this year, the statewide study, which will provide additional deeper dive regional focus in the Detroit region, Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, and Flint, will provide updated data and analysis to comprehensively define and measure the influence of the creative sector and establish a strategy framework so that we can truly begin to cultivate the growth and influence of our creative and design industries statewide. So to date, we've learned from other leading creative economy research studies, policy initiatives at the national, international levels. We've gleaned perspectives from stakeholders in the industries. We've convened community leaders in those key regions, helping us to understand the challenges and opportunities facing the sector today and into the future. And today, we're very excited to be engaging you as we continue this analysis and really prepare the study and the recommendations for its journey toward completion. So we look forward in arm twisting you to be part of that with us. And we're very grateful to the partners for the Phase 2 research study, the U.S. Economic Development Administration, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, the Kresge Foundation, Masco Corporation, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Detroit Creative Quarter Center, and Prima Civitas. Without them, we wouldn't be here sharing advanced highlights today. So with those details and that context out of the way, this morning I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Helen Kerr, president of Kerr Smith Design in Toronto, and Creative Many's research consultant partner, who's going to share highlights and early findings from our research initiative. And a little bit about Helen. She's an industrial designer with over 40 product and process patents. She's recognized by the Canadian government for her experimental work using multidisciplinary approaches to solve complex problems. We think we have that here for the creative economy. She's a professor in research in the Master of Design in Strategic Foresight and Innovation program at OCAD University and has facilitated numerous foresight projects in the government, philanthropic, educational, and financial sectors. And in 2012, Helen was featured in a CBC documentary, Great Minds of Design. With their design-centered approach, Helen and her team at Kerr Smith Design and Nigel Smith, her partner in crime, is here in the audience somewhere, or he's out having coffee because he's proud. There you are, right in front. How'd I miss you? They've really challenged our team in considering greater and bolder possibilities for the influential role of the creative ecosystem in Michigan, in Detroit, and our communities statewide. So please join me in welcoming Helen.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored and humbled to be here, actually. You know, I've met a couple of people in the room. There's lots of big minds here trying to come together to crack a big nut, I think. So thank you for the invitation. So, as Jennifer said, we're coming to you from Toronto. I have a design firm where we tackle issues of the future and issues of innovation. And so those two things together hopefully make me and my team appropriate people to be looking at some of the challenges that are coming for the creative economy and trying to understand not just the numeric values, but also the nature, the context, and the impact of the creative economy in Michigan, and overall too. So how did we begin to tackle the work that we're doing? From the very outset, when we first began the conversation with Jennifer and all the people at Creative Many, we said, you know, quantitative analysis in this case is not going to be enough for us to try and understand what the challenges are and where the potential future is. We need to use multiple methodologies to try and get to some really deep insights about the creative economy here. And so we use both quantitative and qualitative approaches that we are bringing together. And at this point, we haven't finalized any of our findings, but we do have some really intriguing points of interest that we would like to share with you. So, like many people, we drew from pre-existing databases to try and understand quantitatively what the size of the creative economy is here in Michigan and compare it to other places in the United States. We used categories of descriptions of creative industries, and that's a whole other conversation that I think will come up in the first panel that we have. But that's pre-existing categorizations of information. And then we went into census data as well and used other sources of quantitative data, statistical information, to try and put boundaries around the size of the information that we were looking at. But as I said, those pieces of information are not necessarily enough to help us understand contextually what the health and the potential of the creative economy really are. So we began the process of really doing a deep literature review, tried to understand all of the work, and there is a lot of work around the world in different jurisdictions being done to try and understand more completely this sometimes nebulous area that we call creative work and how to define it. And then additionally, because so much of our work is trying to prepare organizations for the future, we tried to gather what we call signals of the future. Where are points of really important information coming from that would indicate to us where change is likely to happen? And I have a few of those that I'd like to talk about today. This morning my husband said to me, did you know that Yogi Berra died? And his famous term was, tell me? The future ain't what it used to be. So today we're going to look at how the future ain't what it used to be too. So once we have begun to gather that information, we compared it to other places. And as you can see from this graph, jurisdictions are different. Sometimes they're cities, sometimes they're regions, sometimes they're states that are trying to compare themselves to other people and to measure their creative industries. And what we found is it was very rare that two places were comparing the same things the same way. And so that's a really important piece of information for us to think about. And so in some senses, maybe Michigan needs to compare itself to Michigan, but on the larger world stage, how do you understand how you are performing against other places? And so what this told us is that that's a really complex question. We tried to sense make the wide range of pieces of information to try and understand how jobs are connected and how a creative piece of information translates out into connected industries in a larger sense. We went out into the state as a whole. We conducted scenario workshops. We call them 3 Horizons workshops in 4 cities across the state. We were in Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Flint, and Detroit, and had large numbers of people participate with us to try and describe what a hopeful future for the creative economy might be. And we were able to extract from that some really interesting insights and very perceptive pictures of how things could change, and mostly for the better. So from all of that, we formulated a series of questions, and I'd like to talk you through them today and give you a little bit of the background to, associate it with the statistical information that we've found along the way. And the first question I'd like to ask is, what is work today? Because as we began the process of trying to describe a creative occupation, art, culture, design, general creativity, we realized that how people understand their work is quite different than it was even 5 years ago. Even the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that, that the era of a full-time job with one employer over a very long period of time that comes with benefits is not necessarily the universal way to understand what work is. And in the creative industries, I think perhaps more than some other industries, people have known that for a really long time. So we live in a time of something like Uber, for example. So Uber announced in January of this year that it now, at that point in time, had 162,000 drivers working for them. That's a pretty large workforce. But those are people who are working essentially on a contingent basis. Either some of them are doing it full-time, but many of them are supplementing their work. And so there are many other things besides Uber where people are doing fractional work to try and make ends meet at the end of the day. But it also gives them freedom. Etsy became a publicly traded company not that long ago. And Etsy, which began as a place for creative people to have a market for their handmade goods, in the last year, their year-end reported in January, said that their gross earnings were $1.93 billion. That's a lot of money, right? And that they had over 53 million members that were engaged in some kind of trade over time. That's a lot, right? And again, those are people who are seeking outlet for their creative output in some ways. Etsy has also recently made the declaration that they will allow people to scale their businesses from them doing individual handmade work to linking them with ethical small-scale manufacturing. Is that the future of manufacturing? Maybe it's a branch of the future of manufacturing and something that we need to pay attention to as creative people who are in the business of making things to trade with other people. I want to tell you a story. And this is somebody that I know, Susie, who went to art school. And while she was in art school, needed to help support her way through school, and she got a job in a restaurant. So you've heard that story before, I think. But for her, when she graduated from school, she continued to work in a restaurant for quite a long time because she was not able to turn the education that she had into a full-time job. So she persisted and she became quite skilled, was training recently to become a sommelier in the restaurant. But lucky for her, she also, fairly recently, a couple of years ago, got a job as a part-time job in a charter school teaching art to high school students. So she's really happy about that. It's a bit of a fulfillment of her degree. And then she went beyond that. She also was able to put together enough money. She and her husband bought a house. She used all her hand skills, which are amazing, to renovate the house herself and create a revenue apartment within the building. And so now she has 3 sources of income. Not just one, and it's not just contingent work. And she kind of likes it that way, right? So she's working in the creative economy as a teacher. She's also working in the not creative economy as a server, and she's got this other income. But if you asked her which of those jobs is the one that she needs to keep over time, what do you think it would be? It's the restaurant job. And the reason why is that's the job that provides her benefits, right? So that's a really important thought. Like, so it's not just the number of people who are working, but the kind of work and the character of the work that they do over time. And just in case you think that Susie is a millennial, she's not. So she's a real person. She's 40 years old, right? So that's in your mind, when you're thinking of people who don't have full-time jobs, we tend to think of them as younger people, maybe less educated people, but they're not always. So Susie's 40, she has a child, but this situation suits her. It's not a 9-to-5 job, and she's her own boss. So essentially what she's doing is she's curating a series of jobs together. And that's a fairly common thing, I would think, so anecdotally, we know that to be true. And so one of the challenges as we go forward is to try and understand what are the new ways to measure things in this economy. Do we have all of the correct data that we need to understand people like Susie and her satisfaction with her job and how she describes herself? So does she describe herself as a teacher? Does she describe herself as an art teacher? Does she describe herself as a restaurant worker? Or is she in the sort of handmade economy, essentially? And she's all of those. And so the ways that we count people and the divisions, the descriptions of the kinds of work that they do are a bit malleable. And so one of the questions going forward, I think, is how can we make more meaningful measures to account for people like Susie? Not everybody is happy with having contingent work. And so the flip side of that, so as empowering as it is for many people, it is also disempowering for many people too. And again, for many people within the creative workforce. So this is a fairly recent, from a fairly recent report by the Government Accountability Office, the Federal Government Accountability Office, that was trying to make sense of the contingent workforce, those who are working not full-time or not permanently and moving between employers. And so an initial measure of the core contingent workforce is as low as 5%, but other measures measure it as high as 30% of our workforce. 30%. That's a lot, right? And so what does that mean to us when that many workers are floating between jobs? And so I suggest to you, and it's not to decide what the result of that or what the recommendation is to that, but that there are implications both for employers who have the benefit of a flexible workforce and more efficient workforce, but the disadvantage of a not loyal workforce and embodied information that moves between people and companies. And then for individuals, there's flexibility in being contingent, but also insecurity. And so I think that this is a really important inflection point as we're counting the size and impact of the creative economy. Another question that we had is, what is the changing nature of work? So how is work different today than it was even 5 years ago, and definitely 10 years ago? So there are many drivers of change in our wide world, but some of them are particular that affect, I think, people in the creative economy. And one of them is automation. So you hear tales of automation all the time. In the auto industry, it's a big deal. In many manufacturing situations, it's a big deal. And Michigan has high competency in automation, in the skills of automation. So when we think of it, we think about manufacturing, right? Lots of machines that are assisting in manufacturing. But there's lots of other ways that automation is coming into our world. So one is self-driving cars. Right? So that's an automated way to perform an activity that people often did for themselves before. And when we have in our minds what automation is all about, we typically think of it as replacing perhaps a blue-collar job. But here's what's coming. Automation in white-collar jobs too. And so this is a pharmaceutical dispensing unit that's available to hospitals. So that's taking some of pharmacy assistants' work away, highly skilled work. Have any of you ever used a robo-advisor? So in the financial world, in accounting, in law, many of the rote pieces of work within those white-collar jobs are now being automated too. So that's fine, maybe, because maybe that doesn't affect us in the creative economy. We think of white-collar jobs, or blue-collar jobs, now white-collar jobs. I had a client in the financial services sector that every time I talked about creative work, he called it purple. So I'm going to say, what about the purple jobs that are out there? Can they be affected by automation too? Yes. So this is an example of an AI-assisted video editing tool. It's an app that you can buy. You feed in all of your footage. It pre-selects for you based on the particular parameters that you would like to see, an exciting video, a dramatic video, a heartwarming video, and then pre-selects automatically which are the best views to be knit together to create an overall edited piece of a video. So would you have thought that that's something that a computer can do? We think of that as being something that requires our eye, our sensitivity, our sense of storytelling. So that's an unexpected thing. And then the other day, some of the work we do is we sometimes do websites. And somebody in my office showed me this. Does everybody know what that is? She said, I guess I'm not going to have a job anymore, eh? And so what it is Grid, which is an AI-enabled web development tool. So again, you feed in the copy and the images, and it sorts by type of website. So you fill in the parameters. I would like to increase sales. I would like to increase my web presence. I would like to, whatever it is, your objective, and the website is automatically generated. I don't mean that you go in and you pick the frameworks. It generates the frameworks for you, which is, so somebody's there with like, right? So how many jobs does that take away? Many. Right? Some of you are nodding. So it's both a threat and an opportunity, right? On the good side, design is a critical function in all of that automation, right? Because you need people to conceive of, to describe, to implement all of those new ways to automate activities. And so what we found when we did our initial data research was that the design, there was an increase in design employees in Michigan over the last time period, and also, importantly, an increase in wages. And I would say, in general, whenever I interviewed people, we did, I'm not sure if I mentioned, we did about 40 long-form, semi-structured interviews with thought leaders all around Michigan, and every time I talked to people, they talked about the pride that they had in the design competency in Michigan. And so here you go. Here, this is an opportunity for Michigan as well. In general, that area that we call content creation or cultural creation is what remains resistant to automation, the conception of new ideas, not the manipulation of it, but the conception of new ideas that remains resilient to mechanization over time. But I would say carefully for now, because how does that change? One of my students works at Google. He has a fairly senior job at Google, and he just looks at me and shakes his head every time I say, well, it's really resistant, right? And he's like, I'm not sure it's resistant. Let's think more. Let's think about how creative activity can be infiltrated into lots of other places. It's the distribution and dissemination and the production and manufacturing that are primarily being disrupted by automation at this point in time. Okay, another key trend, another driver of change is the computational world. So how many of you have a smartphone here? Okay, I don't think there was a hand that didn't go up. So we live in a computational world, right? We are in the process of being both connected and producing continuous streams of data all the time. And that has happened fairly recently. So I always tell people, and they're always shocked, that the iPhone is only 7 years old, maybe 7.5 years old. What did we do before we had smartphones? We didn't have apps. We didn't have the kind of continuous data capture on a social basis that we have at this point in time. So 7 years, that's a massive change in a short amount of time, and the change is coming at us even more quickly. So we have smartphones that are soon to be untethered from our phones. We have smart cars that want to not only talk to us, that's how we see it as humans on the basis, but also capture data about the way that we turn and the way that we do whatever we do in a car. We have smart homes that have interconnected systems, our heating system and our lighting system, and if you have a Nest thermostat, it knows when you want the house hot and when you want the house cold. So we are continuously producing and consuming data. We have smart cities, smart buildings, whole buildings that are able to understand where are people and how should we heat and how should we light and how can we save energy. And then, of course, whole smart cities. So Philadelphia positions itself as a smart city because it has broadband wireless connectivity throughout the city. So again, opportunities and threats, right? So the opportunities are around actual job creation, to understand, to process all that data. It's incredible. One of the things that we found as a missing piece in the measure of creative industries in Michigan and in many places is the inclusion of digital media, and just how important that is to think of it as a creative activity, or a series of creative activities. So we counted, just to try and understand the scope within Michigan. And this is how many people we counted. So a lot. And that is only for Ann Arbor, Grand Rapids, Detroit, and Flint. That's the measure that we were able to count. And so the occupations that we looked at, because that's not a universally accepted definition of digital media. That's part of the problem, is not everybody knows how to put the boundaries around that as a creative activity. We're software and app developers, multimedia artists, animators, web development, and programmers. So what's important is that that number of people represent an additional 40% of creative workers that are not being counted currently. And we understand that their contribution to the economy as a whole is pretty vast, and their creative output can't be, it's not only a mechanized activity, it's really critical that those are people who are thinking in new ways with new technologies that will impact all of us. As I said, everybody talked to me about industrial design. Every time I interviewed somebody, they'd say, oh, Detroit has the most industrial designers. So there's 6.5 times more digital media workers in Michigan than there are industrial designers. And I think that's pretty important for us to be thinking about. But interestingly, Detroit, for example, where the most of them are, still doesn't have as many as people in similar sized cities. So in San Francisco and Boston, obviously they have really long-term digital media development sectors, but also in places like Minneapolis and Austin. Detroit still has lots of place to grow. So the other piece of information is, so those are winners. Those are people whose work is growing, the opportunity is increasing. But there are some people who are really suffering from that whole new multi-platform universe. And so advertising as an occupation has been on a downward trajectory for many years and across the whole of the United States. It's not only in Michigan that that's true, but this is the group that we saw the largest decrease in numbers of people working in that occupation. And so part of it, so we're not entirely certain what the reason for that is, but we know that there are some indicators that in a world where there is continuous connectivity and data acquisition, the role of an advertiser is changed. So if you are able to communicate directly with a brand, what is the intervention of an ad agency? And so it's not that there is no room for people who do that work, but their role has changed, and where those people go to and how they are counted in the future, it's not that everybody has been eliminated, but maybe they call their job something different than it was called before. Okay, so a really important question that people brought up repeatedly when I had these interviews with them is how can we attract more talent to Michigan? There's a gap. If you look at the census data, there's a gap that's a larger gap than the rest of the country in people between the ages of 20 and 50 than other places. So it's like a missing piece of the population in Michigan. So how can we attract people to the state to do the kind of work that will generate more prosperity? And once they're here, how can we retain them? And for those that already are here, how can we grow them to actually become the incredible workforce that we need them to be? And again, from all of the information that we've been gathering, we know that vibrant cities, meaningful jobs, and educational pathways are part of the answer. Not the whole answer, but part of the answer. So just to unpick those a little bit, what does it mean for a place to be a livable city, a livable place, one that people want to come to? And so, of course, people need to have well-paying jobs. They need to have safety. They need to have affordable housing. They need to have green space. They need to be able to walk if they want to and have transportation that's reasonable. But to a large degree, part of what people is seeking is the cultural vibrancy that cities can bring. And so that is happening here. So whether you're talking about Art Prize that's happening this week, go to Michigan House tomorrow, in Grand Rapids, that's a really vibrant addition to a city. Or the music scene here in Detroit and how that's really attractive, especially to younger people. Or public art in Flint that when I spoke to the mayor, he said that was a really integral part of building pride in the city and building a community for the city. Or whether it's having access to film and theater and all of those other performance activities in Ann Arbor. And all of those activities are really critical parts of making a place a desirable place. So not only is it that there are people in the creative industries who are doing the work, being employed, generating income, they're also making places that are better places for people to live, that are desirable places for people to live. And one of the things that you can see is a real increase in the development of cities in Michigan. So we have a little bit of a data glitch in our assessment. So architecture is either the first or the second highest increase in number of employees and number of wages in the whole state. And it shouldn't be really a surprise. There's lots and lots of activity happening here. There are more new establishments created. So architecture is not a dying industry in Michigan. It's thriving, and it's dying in other places, so that's kind of interesting. And architecture runs the whole span, right? It's whether you're talking about restoration architecture or new buildings. Those are both really important ways to build livable cities, to make interesting places. But the flip side of that is we found that performing and visual arts, while there was a small decrease in the numbers of people, very tiny, almost stable in terms of the numbers of people working in those industries, there was a real decrease in their wages. And so if we depend on people being providing the content for those vibrant cities and they can't earn enough money, will they stay? They need to earn living wages. Okay, so the second thing, what's a meaningful job? So there are lots of ways to measure a meaningful job. I talked to a couple of people who talked about how younger people, when they're seeking out jobs, I think one person, maybe Kevin, it was you, said that people are looking for mission, not just money. And that's true. So I teach, and I can tell you that's true. When I hear my students, I teach at the graduate level, and many people are coming, they're mid-career professionals, they're leaving their jobs and looking for something that has much more meaning. And so they want to do work that has purpose. And if they can't find it in their work, how do they have other outlets for it? So one thing is to provide the space for some self-expression. in work. And if you can't do it in the job that you have 9 to 5 or however many hours you're doing it, how can you do it in another way? And another way is to incorporate creative activity into other sectors as well. So these sectors are the concentrated sectors that are pointed to as being important for the future economy of Michigan, but all of them could benefit from creative thinking and the ability to see how you can do good within that world. I'll give you 2 examples. This is Philo, from McGill University. It's they are trying to understand DNA sequencing to do comparative genomics. It's a huge project. They've been working on it for many, many years. And what they did is they brought in game developers to create an online open game and encourage people to participate, to actually find sequences so that they can pare down the number that they feed into their massive computers so that they don't overwhelm it, so they don't burn out the computer, because there's just too many to go through. So they crowdsourced participation, but they also had to work with creative professionals to come up with the idea and to actually implement the idea. So it's bioinformatics plus creativity that is solving problems in a really productive and interesting way. And this is a different example. I have a colleague in India who trained as a musician, really interested in music, but that's not what he does. He works in behavioral economics, trying to develop new ways to solve behavioral problems. And in India, they had a real problem with people who cross train tracks, irrespective of how quickly the trains are coming, get hit by the trains often. They built bridges, they built warning signs, none of those worked. And he, because he had studied music, knew about research that had been done at Stanford looking at music and attentiveness and how you could reframe sound to become a warning signal for people. And so they actually developed a new warning signal on the train and decreased deaths by 55% fairly quickly. So music crashes on the train tracks, you wouldn't have thought they go together. But that's the kind of new thinking that we need and that people want to incorporate into their work. And then finally, in the set, what are future-ready skills? What are the kinds of things that people need going into the future? We don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be, but we do know that it's a changed universe. And so some of the things that people will need are critical thinking and sense-making, creativity and experimentation, the ability to prototype and fail, and resilience and adaptive thinking. And those are all things that people learn when they learn to create. And so how can we incorporate that from kindergarten right through to grade 12, and then also in higher education as we move forward? So that's not on the screen, I don't know why, but that's supposed to be a picture. I'll describe it to you. That's a picture of the ad campaign from here, from CCS. Talk to your kids about art. And I think it's an amazing, maybe it edited it out because I'm not supposed to put it here, I don't know. I think it's an amazing way to talk to the world about the importance of art education and the opportunities for art education and the potential that it gives to people going forward. Many people think that STEM is the only way to make a productive future, and I would say that that's leaving out a large portion of the population that maybe is not able to participate, is not going to advance through math and engineering, but have significant contributions to make. And also for young people, particularly in disadvantaged places, who get told that maybe sports is their only alternative if they're looking at what their future potential, if they can't make it in a STEM occupation, then they better go into sports. Well, how much of that creativity is being not harnessed, and how can we make sure that it is? However, when we did our analysis of the data, what we saw was that although artists and fine art schools had slight increase in wages, that there was a decrease in the number of employees in that situation. And so that feels like a disconnect. We want people to learn to be creative. We need people to teach them to be creative. They can't always learn on their own. Okay. Does investment matter? Thanks. Does investment matter? I would say yes. And just quickly to go through a few statistics, and I'm sure this is maybe not a surprise to you, but when we measured for film, TV, and broadcast, in the time period, so 2011 to 2012, there was a significant decrease in number in wages overall, and a large decrease in the number of employees within that sector, and that corresponds to changing funding environment. And so there is a straight link connection between investment and the kind of work that's available. And just to sum up, just the overall numbers for the state, this is how many people actually work in all of those sectors combined. And so it's a lot. However, it's slightly down, but it's almost stable, slightly down from the year before. But what it isn't keeping pace with is the number of employees overall in the state. And I know that there are changes, great changes, a reduction in unemployment in the state, but the creative industry should be rising as well at the pace that other industries are rising. This is how much money people earned in the creative industries overall. And so it's just a slight increase from the previous time period. But in the equivalent time period, there was a much larger increase in wages overall in Michigan. And so again, investment and attention to this sector, I think, is critically important going forward, that we should be outpacing maybe the rest of the economy, not lagging. And so just very finally, creative industries do matter to the future of Michigan. Thank you very much. So we have a very small amount of time if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. Maybe you need to think, there's a lot of data. Yep. So the question is, can I paraphrase, are we counting people correctly, right? So for example, if you're a designer and you're working for a manufacturer, are you counted as a manufacturer or counted as a designer? And I would say that is part of what we need to look at going forward, because I think that there are people who are missed, right? So people who are sole proprietors working on their own are not always counted as employees. And people who are doing more than one thing, freelancers, are not always counted, and there are a lot of freelancers. So I would say that that's quite a bit of work that needs to be done going forward, and I know that there are a lot of initiatives underway trying to figure out the best way to categorize the work that's being done. And also, many jobs are changing. So what we called something previously is now a hybrid job, like in everything else. So I talked about bioinformatics. That didn't exist before, right? And so how would you categorize somebody who does that? And so in the creative professions, we are changing also. Any other questions? Yep.
Thanks. From your research, can you give some highlights that compare Detroit to other cities where we excel, the good news, and then maybe a couple of low points?
We will be able to do that. We've begun to look at it, but I would say that we're not really conclusive about it yet. We know we did a small study on similar sized cities. So we looked at, as I mentioned, Minneapolis, Austin, Boston, and San Francisco. And in visual arts, we had the top, when we looked at not percentages, but total employees in that area. And so in visual arts, Detroit was top. But in most of the other areas, Detroit lagged. But that's not conclusive, and we're still kind of working in that. When I talked about a blip. We have weird measures for music, and that's why I haven't spoken about music as a particular category, because we're not sure that we're comparing correctly apples to apples right at this point in time, and so we're still working on some of that data. Any other questions? No? I just want to thank you all again, and mostly I'd like to thank Creative Many for inviting us to be part of this. It's been an amazing journey to get to this point. The people at Creative Many, if you don't know them already, are amazing, hardworking, smart, and you couldn't have put this work in better hands than with them. So thank you.